For today's lecture, let's discuss the addition and subtraction of complex numbers. First, let's have a look at the addition of complex numbers and then we will discuss subtraction of complex numbers. For addition, let we have two complex numbers in general form, z and w. Z is equal to a plus ib and w is equal to c plus id. Now we want to add these two complex numbers. So z plus w is equal to a plus ib plus c plus id. Now, one most important thing you should know about addition of two complex numbers is that you can add a real part into another real part and an imaginary part into another imaginary part. I have told you about real and imaginary part of complex numbers in my previous lecture. Here we have two real parts, a and c. So we will add a and c. As a result, we will get a plus c. And similar to real parts, we have two imaginary parts, b and d. So we will add b and d. As a result, we will get ib plus id. As I is common in both numbers, so we can write this number ib plus id into this form, b plus d into I. So the final equation of the sum of two complex numbers is equal to a plus c plus b plus d into I. This is the real part, this is an imaginary part. For example, let we have two complex number 3 minus 2i that is equal to z and 5 plus 4i that is equal to w. So the sum of these two complex numbers would be equal to 3 minus 2i plus 5 plus 4i. Now keep in mind we should add a real part into another real part and an imaginary part into another imaginary part. So look at this equation. What are the real parts and what are the imaginary parts? So you can see 3 and 5 are the real parts of this equation and minus 2 and positive 4 are the imaginary parts of this equation. So 3 plus 5 is equal to 8 and minus 2i plus 4i is equal to 2i. So this is the sum of complex number z and w, 8 plus 2i. 8 is the real part and 2 is the imaginary part. So this is the addition of complex number. Now let's move towards subtraction of complex numbers. For subtraction, again let we have two complex numbers in general form, z and w. Z is equal to a plus ib and w is equal to c plus id. We want to subtract a complex number w from complex number z. For this purpose, z minus w is equal to a plus ib minus into c plus id. Now we should know, if we multiply any equation with a negative number, then that negative number always changes the signs of equation. So before the multiplication with a negative number, the complex number is positive c, positive id. After the multiplication with the negative number, this complex number would be minus c or negative c and negative id, negative real part, negative imaginary part. Now for subtraction, again there is a method, that is we can subtract a real part from another real part and an imaginary part from another imaginary part. Means it is not possible to subtract a real part from an imaginary part or imaginary part from another real part. Now look at this equation. There are two real parts, minus c and a, and two imaginary parts, positive b and negative d. So we will subtract a negative c from positive a, that is equal to a minus c, and we will subtract a negative id from positive ib, that would be equal to ib minus id. Now as I is a common in both numbers, so we can write this imaginary number ib minus id into this form, b minus d into I. So this is the final result of subtraction of one complex number from another complex number, that is equal to a minus c plus b minus d into I. This is real part, this is an imaginary part. Let we have two complex numbers. To better understand the subtraction, we have z and w. Z is equal to 4 minus 7i and w is equal to 3 plus 2i. Now subtract the complex number w from complex number z. So z minus w is equal to 4 minus 7i minus into 3 plus 2i. Before multiplication, the complex number has a positive real part and positive imaginary part. After multiplication, the complex number will have a negative real part and negative imaginary part, and we have an equation 4 minus 7i minus 3 minus 2i. Now again subtract a real part from another real part and imaginary part from another imaginary part. There are two real parts, 4 and minus 3, so 4 minus 3 would be equal to 1, and two imaginary parts, minus 7 and minus 2. So minus 7 and minus 3 is equal to minus 9. So 1 minus 9i. So this is the result of subtraction of complex number w from complex number z. So this is the real part and minus 9 is the imaginary part. So this is how we can add and how we can subtract two complex numbers. Now after this lesson you are able to subtract and add two complex numbers.